Hi, I'm Margot, and this is the story of how a forgotten envelope, a half-remembered boy, and a lakeside cabin no one ever mentioned changed the way I saw my family. And myself. My mother gave my sister everything out loud. The heirlooms, the money, the praise. What she gave me came in silence, sealed in old handwriting, hidden under a cedar chest, and delivered only after she was gone. But maybe that silence was trying to say something all along. Before we go any further, tell me, have you ever felt quietly forgotten by your own family? If yes, comment number 1. If no, comment number 0. This is a family drama you don't want to miss. I thought everything ended at the cemetery, until the letter arrived, written in Mom's unmistakable slanted script. The envelope had no return address, only my name in that tidy cursive I hadn't seen in years. I turned it over in my hands like a stone from a beach I never meant to revisit. The paper felt thicker than usual, heavy, intentional. That morning, I'd made a cup of decaf and turned on the old classical station Mom used to hum along to, though I never told anyone I listened now. The apartment smelled of ginger and window rain. Mr. Willis, the postal worker with the peppermint habit, had left one again, tucked under the envelope flap like a quiet kindness. The message inside was short. Look under the cedar chest. And remember the Finch boy. I sat for a while, rereading the words. The cedar chest. That thing still lived in the attic, far back beneath boxes of Roz's trophies and Mom's never-used sewing machine. I hadn't thought of that room in years. And the Finch boy? My memory fumbled like a flashlight in a dark basement. One name floated up. Jonah Finch. Small. Quiet. 6th grade? Something about a playground. Something about boys who thought bruises made them stronger. The voicemail from Roz had come earlier that week, her voice as brisk as the Asheville air I hadn't breathed since college. Estate's done. House will be sold soon. Come by if you want anything sentimental. No mention of the letter. No mention of Mom's handwritten coda. I stood, letter still in hand, and walked to the shelf by the kitchen. Past photos I kept more for obligation than affection. In one frame, Mom was barely visible, half smiling behind Roz, who sparkled in her cap and gown. I wasn't in that picture. I didn't take it. By late afternoon, I'd booked a train to Asheville. No plans to stay long. I packed Edith's cardigan, some notebooks, and a tin of chamomile tea I hadn't opened since her diagnosis. As the sun dipped, I ran my hand along the envelope's crease one last time and tucked it into the inside pocket of my coat. I didn't expect answers, but I wasn't ready for how many more questions that letter would bring. The porch light still flickers like it always did, like it couldn't decide whether to welcome or warn me. It buzzed faintly in the twilight, casting a weak yellow halo over the front steps as I stood at the base of the walkway with my bag in hand. The last time I'd seen this house, the maple tree in the front yard still had leaves. Now, bare branches clawed against the sky like brittle fingers. The doorknob turned before I could knock. Roz stood there, arms crossed, framed by the same front hallway rug we used to fight over for Christmas presents. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "You made it," she said, stepping aside. "I said I would," I replied, brushing past her and into the familiar hallway. The air smelled faintly of lavender sachets, cedar polish, and something else, dust layered over memory. She led me to the guest room without much conversation. My old room, of course, had become a reading space. Hers remained untouched. I nodded, said thank you, and waited until I heard her footsteps pad away. I crept upstairs. The attic door creaked just like it used to, and I pulled the string to switch on the single bulb overhead. The cedar chest sat exactly where I remembered, nestled under a yellowing American flag and Roz's prom dress. I crouched and ran my fingers beneath it. Something crackled. A small, unmarked envelope had been taped to the floorboard. I peeled it away slowly. Inside, a hand-drawn map and a single line in Edith's voice, "Where you first stood up for him." The attic grew colder. I sat on a dusty cushion and stared at the note, trying to coax the memory out of hiding. A playground, shouts, a boy, Jonah Finch, cornered by kids older than us. I'd stepped in, hadn't I? Just once, just loud enough, and I never told anyone. I couldn't imagine Edith even remembering. Or cared. Back downstairs, I made myself tea in Mom's old mug, chipped along the rim but still standing. I stared out the window across the street. Co-Vesta was tending her porch plants, just like she had 20 years ago. We made eye contact. She gave a slow, knowing nod. Did Mom remember that moment? And if she did, why only now? Roz used to call me dramatic. Funny, I was always the one who kept quiet. The words looped in my head as I stepped lightly across the hallway, careful not to wake the creaking boards that remembered my childhood weight too well. In the kitchen, Roz was already stirring instant oatmeal at the stove. Back to me, shoulders hunched like always. "You were up late," she said without turning. "Jet lag," I lied, even though I'd taken the train. She didn't respond, just kept stirring. Later that morning, I pulled on Mom's old cardigan. It still smelled faintly of cedar and cloves, and walked to the public library. A chill wind threaded through the narrow streets of Asheville. The library's wooden doors groaned in welcome, and the warmth inside felt like a relic from another decade. Mrs. Henley sat behind the circulation desk, wearing the same silver bun and owl-shaped brooch as when I was 12. She blinked, then smiled. "Margot Ellery, you're back." I nodded. "Just for a bit." She reached under the counter. "Your mom used to bring in boxes of donated books every December. Never left her name." I paused. "She never told me that." Mrs. Henley just gave a knowing smile. "She didn't tell me much either." I found an old yearbook from middle school and traced the photos until I saw him. Jonah Finch. Quiet face, eyes cast downward. Next to his picture, a caption about winning a school essay contest. Then a clipped article from the local paper. Family moves after alleged bullying incident. A memory resurfaced. Jonah cornered, eyes wild, kids laughing. I'd shouted at them, trembling and small, but they left. I hadn't seen him again after 6th grade. I searched his name online and found a website for a freelance restoration expert. Old documents, calligraphy, archival preservation. The contact form had one field. "What would you like to restore?" I typed. "A memory, I think." My name is Margot Ellery Hours, past. Roz avoided me like a shadow at noon. When I finally checked my phone, one new message blinked back. "Your mother called me. Jonah adds one line." I kept what she gave me. "If you're ready, let's talk." I always thought Mom kept things from me out of resentment, never out of trust. The thought caught me off guard as I pushed open the cafe door. A small bell chimed overhead, and the warm scent of cinnamon and coffee wrapped around me like a worn quilt. The red mug was still as cozy as I remembered. Wood-paneled walls, mismatched mugs, and a bulletin board full of handwritten ads and church bake sales. Jonah was already at a corner table, cradling a black coffee in both hands. He looked older than I remembered, broader shoulders, gray beginning to touch his temples, but his eyes were the same, quiet, observant, kind. He stood as I approached, smiling without hesitation. "Margot," he said. "You came." "I wasn't sure I would," I admitted, sliding into the booth across from him. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a thick envelope, carefully sealed. "Your mother called me a few weeks before she passed. Said you might come looking. Asked if I could keep this safe." I stared at the envelope. My name was written on the front. No flourish, no message, just Margot. I broke the seal. Inside, a notarized document and a handwritten note. The document was a codicil, an amendment to Edith's will. It granted me full ownership of a cabin by Wynwood Lake. Nothing extravagant. Just a small place she'd kept quiet. The note read, "For the one who never asked." I blinked hard, trying to absorb the words. Jonah said nothing, just let the moment breathe. Finally, I looked up. "Why you?" I asked softly. He shrugged. "She said I owed you something, that you once gave your voice when no one else did. I guess she hoped I'd do the same." I folded the papers and slid them back into the envelope. "Roz doesn't know," I said. "Does she need to?" He asked gently. I didn't answer. Back at the house, I tucked the envelope into the bottom drawer of my old dresser. The wood groaned like it remembered me. Later that evening, I stepped out to the porch. Across the street, Vesta switched on her porch lights, tiny glowing orbs in the shape of snowflakes. She met my eyes and gave that same slow, knowing nod. That night, Roz knocks on my door. "You went to see him, didn't you?" There are some truths that can only be spoken in front of a fire, when the flames distract you from the weight of words. The house had gone quiet again, that heavy kind of quiet that feels older than sound. I made 2 cups of chamomile tea, setting one on the table beside Roz's chair. She hadn't said much since last night. Neither had I. The fire crackled low in the hearth, throwing light and shadow against the living room walls. Edith's old shawl was draped over the back of the sofa. The silver spoon she always stirred her honey with now rested in my cup. Roz sat curled in Mom's favorite chair, arms crossed, staring at the flames like they owed her something. I waited, holding my cup in both hands. Finally, she spoke. "So, what is it? Some letter? Another trick from the past?" I shook my head. "Not a trick. A codicil," her brow furrowed. "What's that?" "An amendment to the will," I said. "She left me the cabin at Wynwood Lake." Roz blinked. "She never told me about that place." "She told Jonah and me." Through the letter, Roz's jaw tightened. "Of course. She always liked her secrets." The doorbell rang. Vesta stepped inside, holding a folded envelope. "She wanted you to have this," she said softly, handing it to Roz. "Only if Margot ever came home." Roz opened it with shaking hands. The letter was brief. Apology didn't come easily to Edith, but she had tried. She wrote that she had loved us both, but didn't know how to love us the same way. That she envied my steadiness, my silence. That Roz had been her mirror, but I'd been her reminder. Roz didn't cry. She just stared at the paper like it had cracked something inside her she couldn't name. I stood and placed a tissue on the table beside her, then sat again. We didn't need to speak. After a long time, Roz looked up. "So what now?" I replied. "I'm not here to take back what you got. I came to claim what I never did. Peace. Some inherit land or heirlooms. I inherited the truth, and a quiet place to keep it. The cabin at Wynwood Lake was smaller than I imagined. Paint peeling from the shutters, porch creaking under my step, chimney leaning just a little too far left. But there was something gentle in its tiredness, like it had been waiting for someone to notice it again. Inside, the air smelled of pine and old books. The windows let in soft winter light, and the wooden floors had grooves worn smooth by time. There was no television, just a battered radio and a stack of crossword puzzles. I dropped my overnight bag near the door and stood still, listening to the quiet. I walked from room to room. The kitchen had a spice rack labeled in Edith's handwriting. In the back bedroom, an old quilt lay folded at the foot of the bed, stitched in squares of fabric I recognized from childhood dresses. And on the mantel, above the stone fireplace, sat a photo in a brass frame. Me, about 8, holding a pine cone with both hands. Mom stood just behind, smiling at something out of frame. Behind a row of cookbooks, I found a second envelope. This one was addressed simply, "For when she's ready." Inside, a short note in fading ink. "I didn't know how to love you out loud, but I did. Every day." The air thickened. I placed the note gently beside the photo and sat on the porch steps, mug of coffee cradled close. Birds hopped along the railing. The lake shimmered faintly in the distance, half crusted with early frost. Jonah arrived not long after, a brown paper bag in hand. "Bagels," he said, "and blueberry jam, the kind they served at that cafe in town." We sat together without needing much talk. I showed him the letter. He didn't say anything at first, just nodded and poured more coffee. I placed the old photo on the mantel, next to a branch of fresh pine I'd picked up that morning. The house didn't feel like a monument. It felt like a beginning. Jonah nudges her arm. "You still write, don't you?" I smile. Maybe it's time I started again. Some inherit money, others memories. But I received a quiet truth, folded gently inside a life I never knew she saved for me. It didn't come with celebration or apology, but with pine-scented mornings, handwritten spice labels, and the silence of a mother who had tried in her own imperfect way. Sometimes the kindest gifts are the ones never announced, just waiting, patiently, to be found by those willing to look beyond what's obvious. Because when we stop measuring love by what was said out loud, we begin to understand the language of care written in quieter ink. Like the hush of snowfall on a porch roof, grace often arrives uninvited, but always right on time. Join me if you'd like to hear more heartfelt, meaningful stories about life by hitting the subscribe button. I'll be right here, ready to share more, walk with you further, and listen a little deeper. Thank you for listening, and until next time,